the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So again, good evening, everyone. I'm Shameen Sandhu in the role of System Leader for Mental Health and Professional Support Services here at TDSB, and this is the second part of the three-part series of healthy versus unhealthy relationships. This series is also part of the relationship group at Montage Support Services, and tonight's session is about healthy relationships and boundaries. I am again very excited to introduce you all to Deanna Jose, sexual health promoter at Montage Support Services. Deanna, wave a little bit and just and Tracy O'Regan, community inclusion and advocacy supervisor, educational consultant from Community Living Toronto. Tracy and Deanna are going to provide us with more wonderful information and strategies and learnings for parents and caregivers who have children with special education needs. And they're also going to take us through a discussion about key elements to healthy relationships and boundaries. We are so excited at TDSB to have partnered with both Deanna and Tracy because both of you just bring in a tremendous wealth of information. And I just want to remind everybody that the last part of the healthy versus unhealthy relationship series is going to conclude on Wednesday, May 31st. And that is about healthy relationships and what is abuse. A few kind housekeeping points, please, if everybody can just remember this. If you keep your mics turned off during the presentation, and there will be an opportunity to take questions after the presentation for Deanna and Tracy. And we will also be providing resource links at the end with additional resources and supports for parents and guardians in the chat. Now I am honored again to turn it over to the lovely Deanna and Tracy to begin the presentation. Thank you both for being here again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So for those who came last week, welcome back. For those who this is their first session, welcome. We're happy to have you. This is a second part of a three-part series, as was mentioned, and we just want to do a quick recap of last week to let everyone know sort of what we talked about. But today we're talking about healthy relationships and types of boundaries. But before we get into it, we're just going to do a quick review of last week. And perhaps if anyone has any questions, we do have chat. People can ask questions in the chat feature. We'd like to get through our session, and then what we'll do is just take the questions at the end, if that's okay. And just a quick little introduction about myself. My name is Deanna Jose. I go by the pronouns she and her, and I am the sexual health promoter for the relationship group. I get the privilege of spending a lot of time with the relationship group members, which is over 50% self-advocates, along with staff and community members. We do a lot of different types of educational work, from one-on-one support to teaching staff about healthy relationships, empowering self-esteem training, to pretty much everything that has to do with healthy relationships. And I've been probably at this for close to 20 years. And I also work through Montage. I work with victims, survivors of domestic human trafficking. And that is a really important program as well. So I would say that the lens that we provide today in the healthy relationship is something that we see lifelong. And so we're really excited to share that with you today. I'll let Tracy introduce herself.
Sure, thank you. Like Shameen told you earlier, so my name is Tracy O'Regan, and I do work for an organization called Community Living Toronto. I've actually worked with people with disabilities for 33 years now. It's my anniversary this year. It's pretty exciting. And in my various roles, I've supported families, I support individuals who identify as having an intellectual disability. But what we're here to talk about today, when we're talking about healthy relationships, it's something that Deanna and I have done a lot of work with together and separately, supporting adults mainly with intellectual disabilities that may have missed out on some opportunities to develop healthy relationships, and therefore, struggle to develop them themselves. We also do a program called Relationships in You, and that's something we do for community members and we do in schools as well, both at the TDSB and the Catholic Board. It's an exciting program, teaching all about different relationships, not just sexual, but there is a strong focus on sexual relationships. But tonight we're here to talk about a little bit about different kinds of relationships, and we'll just go through a little bit about what we talked about last time first. So everything is a relationship. When we talk about relationships, so many times, you know, even when I started doing the program Relationships in You, I chose that title very purposefully. Many times when people hear relationships, they automatically think about sexual relationships. And what Deanna and I learned over our many years and our experience working with people with disabilities is that there's always this misunderstanding that when we talk about relationships, it always has to be about intimate or sexual relationships. And what we've learned in the course of our work is that everything that we do is a relationship. And we'll explain that a little bit more. Okay. So interactions are relationships. So every interaction that you have with someone in different capacities is what we would consider a relationship. So for example, if you're in a store, you have a relationship as a customer. If you're riding a bus, you have a relationship with the driver and the other passengers. When you're at school, there's a student-teacher relationship. Everything is a relationship and has a different form of etiquette that goes with it. People with disabilities, unfortunately, have missed out a lot on learning what are those pieces of etiquette and what behaviors do we need to actually interact with others in a careful and safe manner. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Next one. Okay, so social exclusion, and this we talked a bit about last time. Many people with intellectual disabilities who Deanna and I support have been socially excluded. And whether it's at school, whether it's in the community, whether it's at, just typical community relationships, and therefore require some extra attention when they're developing the skills to navigate different relationships and learning that relationships are not just about what happens to them. Like a lot of times people approach relationship as if it's always something happening to me. And what Deanna and I like to get across to most people is that relationships are require active participation, right? They require, the ability to understand your comfort level and the comfort level of other people. It requires a strong understanding of what's expected of yourself and other people. And we're going to explore that a little bit further. Okay. Now, this is something that we talked a lot about last time. It's about consent. And I asked Deanna to put this back up here because the acronym FRIES is really, it's a really good way of explaining consent to people of different levels of understanding, right? So when we talk about consent, and Deanna and I will mention consent a lot during our conversations because it comes up a lot, we want to be clear that what we're talking about is when information is given first of all, freely given. So let's look at FRIES, right? F, freely given, which means you're not being coerced. And that's sometimes a hard concept for people with disabilities and neurotypical people to understand. But consent, to be true consent, must be freely given. It can also be reversible, right? Just because you say yes right now in the moment doesn't mean you mean yes in future moments. You can always take back your consent. If you're feeling uncomfortable or you've changed your mind, consent can be reversible. Informed. Informed is a hard one. Informed means that you have all the information that you require to make a freely given or reversible decision. Now, this is where a lot of people that we've supported over the years really struggle with. Sometimes people will put a piece of paper in front of them and say, you understand what you're signing, but they haven't been given the information as to what they're consenting to. So it's okay to begin the conversation with yes or no ideas, but we have to make sure that people with disabilities are getting all the information they can to make an informed consent. Enthusiastic. Enthusiastic is an interesting one. And again, this is where I'll bring up the word coercion, right? Enthusiastic means that there are no coercive things pushing someone into making a decision, right? They want to make that decision. They want to say yes, they want to say no, but it needs to be enthusiastic. They must agree to it, and not that kind of, well, I guess so. If you're hearing them say that in that kind of a tone, then you understand that they're not giving enthusiastic consent. And specific. Specific is what we are agreeing to at the moment, at this point in time. So I'm agreeing to one thing, but I'm not agreeing to another thing. And I think I like the example here that you'll see on the chart that, you know, when you're, oh, sorry, this is not moving. Saying yes to one thing, like going to the bedroom to make out, doesn't mean they've said yes to others, like oral sex. So what we're saying here is that consent needs to be given often and freely. Go to the next one. Great. And what we talked about last time too was what informs our decisions. How do we come to our decisions about consent? Well, we talk about values, right? A person's values really influence what decisions a person will make. And it's for people with disabilities, sometimes it's a lot more difficult or a lot harder for them to identify why are they making certain decisions. So we always like to talk about, you know, how our decisions are made, what values are shaping our beliefs, and how those values will help us interact with other people. And it needs to be a discussion too about how our values can be disagreed upon, right? So Deanna and I may not share always the same values, and that disagreements are okay, but that it's okay to hold true to your values and beliefs as well. Next one.
So as we reviewed sort of what we discussed last week, we just want to get into what is a healthy relationship, or what is health. It's really, really important to make the distinction and for all of us to understand. And also when you educate or have discussions, that we look at health as being sort of two major things, right? One is your heart health, your cholesterol, your physical health. When you go to the doctor, you get all these things tested. You go for your physical and you get those things tested. That's one kind of health. But the other kind of health, and we know with individuals who have an intellectual development disability, require probably a lot of health from the moment they're born to as we get older. And what's really important is that we honor that, obviously, but we have to also acknowledge the fact that we have to provide education around sexual health, mental health, healthy relationships, and emotional health. All those things are just as important as knowing what someone's heart rate is and their physical fitness level. And we've learned that over the last several years during the pandemic, because all these things are really, really tested. And we know that mental health affects your heart rate, your cholesterol, your blood, because of the stress that occurs. And so we really want folks to understand there needs to be a balance. And in a healthy relationship, those balance are things like respect and care and communication and laughter and encouragement and relationships and listening and love, and all those things are a part of that. And we want to focus less on, you know, eating healthy and the blood pressure, focus more on all the other areas of life that need to be supported in order to have someone have a fully healthy life. And this is an area where a lot of our folks are neglected, or the education and resources aren't provided in the same way. And we know as they grow up, they become adults, and as adults, they may or may not have the skill sets to stay healthy. And we know that when they're young, we can set some opportunities and teach to allow people to navigate those relationships in a different, healthier way. what you're seeing here is some really positive images, okay? And so visuals are really important, and conversations you can have is you can ask someone, what do you see in these images? How does it make you feel? It's important not to tell people what is happening, but kind of find out what they know and then add more detail to it. Healthy relationships, like anything, is something that we have to learn and teach what that is, what they see and how they feel when they see it. And so there's a lot of pieces of communication that we have to work through to make sure that we are able to communicate with all the different types of learning styles. So you'll see here, you see two people in front of each other, one with a hand on the face and their heads down. It's like, how do you think they're happy? Do you think that that's healthy? Yes or no? And ask the questions and ask what they see. We'll see an image with, there is a person with the hand in the back of another person. And what does that make you feel or see? Do you think that person's being supported? Do you think that's a healthy way to touch someone? Do you think they're friends? Do you think they're more than friends? Or do you think the person's upset? All of those things are an incredible conversation with one visual. The same with the next image. So who is the person in the next image? What is happening here? What kind of hug and touch is that? And do you think that's healthy? Right? We look at the hands, we look at the smile, the face, the position. And finally, the bottom one where there's the one person holding the shoulder and shaking the hands of the other person. That's a very good positive handshake, and that's a great way to show communication as well and touch. And why are they touching the hand and also the shoulder, right? So have those conversations and see what they think and feel. And if you're able as a family member, you can rehearse and practice these kind of touches, right? And see what they feel. It's a great way to practice in a setting just to get people to understand and learn. Trace, do you have any thoughts?
I do. I mean, when we're talking about, using the visuals, I think something, there's a lot of people that we've both supported over the years that don't use speech as communication, right? And the importance of visuals in getting across some positive ways of interacting with people. And it's also, we had mentioned last time during our presentation that there's a great program called Circles, right? And using visuals like this is another tool to help people understand what are the different expectations for the different relationships. So if you're using, more of a relationship mapping, you can use the Circles program and talking about, what's an appropriate way to interact with people in the different forms of the circles. What I also like about here is, this is where, and I think part of when Deanna and I are teaching about relationships to people that we're supporting, we can't miss the opportunity to talk about the physical sensations that come with emotions, right? We see, like Deanna mentioned, there's a smile here, there's a nice touch, supportive touch on the back, there's a hug, the image on the left may be a bit more intimate, but it's important to not only just talk about, ways of acting or words to be used in communication. We'll talk a bit about communication at a later time, but always to reference back to how they make you feel, right? And I think back to what Deanna was saying earlier about the physical health and your heart rate and stuff. And that's a great way for people to start to understand if they're feeling safe. If they feel that it's a good touch, bad touch, is it something that they are desiring, or is it something they want to stand off from? Have that conversation, if you can, about how it makes you feel, right? We see the smiles, but again, trust your gut is something that Deanna and I have always taught to people with disabilities. Trust how you're actually feeling, because relationships do bring physical sensations to the body, right? So it's always good to check in that way as well.
I think one of the things that's important just to point out is that relationships like these images here all come in different forms with the different people you come across. So we talk about the boundary circles, and we talk about relationship with strangers versus friends versus family, maybe versus for someone you're in a relationship with or a partner. And what I want to just point out is how we touch our work and engage with people is incredibly important, and it creates healthy relationships. So if you have one of your kids going to school and they see their teacher, what is their interaction? What is their touch like with their teacher? Is it a side hug? Is it a high five? All of those things form that healthy relationship. All those things inform what that looks like. And so you have to model that behavior as well and ask questions. Things like when you watch TV shows, or you're having discussions, or you watch someone in a store, or there's certain situations where you observe, talk about it in those moments. Have a discussion. It's examples of it are constantly around us. We just don't talk about it. And when you talk about it out loud, then people start to see it and they start to understand it. And then I ask, how would you feel if, right? If there's a certain show. And when someone can identify or relate, then that education becomes even more impactful. So it's a constant conversation, it's constant education, and also just sort of like, people can't articulate how they feel. Is it a yes feeling or a no feeling, right? So you can simplify the conversation around how healthy relationships and touch, however their language, but talk about it. There should be no assumptions or no just ignoring it. It does make a huge difference long term.
Yeah, and you should always be practicing consent, right? As much as possible. I don't know how old your children are, but when children with disabilities do become adults, they're going to have to start making some decisions on their own. So the more practice you can give to actually practicing giving consent and what that means, starting off with small things, going to the bigger things, I think that's also really important.
Yeah, and I also think, just to add to that, we know, we want to be friendly and kind, and I think one of the conversations I just had with a gentleman the other day who's in his 40s, he likes to say hello to people and tell them his name, right? He likes to disclose a lot more information than an average person would or should. And so I applauded the fact that he was very polite and kind, but I actually said the only thing I would change was I just wouldn't give your name. I would just say, hello, how are you, right? And that shifts things a little bit. It still is a healthy relationship. You're still being kind, but you're also creating some boundaries. And that shift has made a huge difference. And how he interacts, his staff has actually said that that's been a really positive experience. So we don't want to discourage people from being friendly. We just want to discourage people from being vulnerable, and also understanding the boundaries of those healthy relationships. Same with if someone likes to touch, right? So modeling behavior. If your child likes to touch people or do certain things, you have to say, well, you have to ask, can I touch you? You should do the same thing and model the same thing. So those are the kind of examples that are really effective in having conversation. Is we're not asking you to stop or not do certain things, but just sort of model, and also use healthy relationship techniques to make sure it's going to impact them for the long game, right? Tracy, I'll let you start this off.
Yeah, sure. I always love acronyms like FRIES and SHARE and those kind of things. They're just really good reminders of how we can support our children in developing healthy relationships. SHARE is a really good one. With SHARE, the first thing is S is for safety, right? We want people to, when they're looking at the relationships they're in, and you can do this with the Circles program, right? Like you can look at, what does it mean, with your interactions with your teachers, we know people with disabilities may be involved with a lot of different therapists, right? OTs, speech language, all those kind of things. You don't have to always jump to like girlfriend, boyfriend, those kind of more intimate relationships, but think about safety, right? So when you're in this relationship, are you safe? Are you not being harmed? Are you not being ridiculed? You're not being put down. But it's also a way to, again, that conversation about not always being passive. And we'll talk a bit about more communication styles later. But the key here is, again, not looking at relationships or something that are done to me, right? I am part and I'm interacting. So yes, I want to be safe, but are my behaviors making someone else feel safe, right? So you can approach the conversation in both ways. When we look at H, we want about honesty, right? So a healthy relationship is one where you can talk about your feelings and your emotions, right? Knowing that you can disagree, right? A lot of times, Deanna and I have come across other people teaching about relationships, and it is always expressing the positivity, which is a great thing, don't get me wrong, but we have to remember that disagreements are typical things, right? You could be disagreeing with your parents, you could be disagreeing with your siblings, with your teachers, with, you know, your camp counselors. Disagreements will happen. But there's a way of disagreeing, right? There's techniques to communication and conflict resolution. So the H is for honesty, right? Is this a relationship where I can honestly say how I'm feeling about the interaction? And then we look at the A, the accept, right? Is the person accepting me for who they are, or are they trying to change me, right? And this goes into, we use that word a lot about coercion, right? So are they just accepting me when I do things that they like, or are they actually accepting me for who I am, right? For my values, my beliefs, the way I interpret the world, the way I communicate, the way I participate in the world. Are they actually accepting me for who I am, right? And then we talk about R, respect, right? You see this a lot. Deanna and I have both, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking for Deanna, but I know our work together. We do see it a lot where there is a definite hierarchy in relationships, especially for adults that have an intellectual disability. There's a hierarchy in, you know, their relationships with therapists, their relationships with teachers. And I mean, some of that is natural, right? I mean, young children do have to follow certain rules and they have responsibilities. We're not suggesting that that's not the case, but they fall into a pattern where they expect that, right? They may expect that they lack the ability to maybe judge the situation and the different types of relationships. So this can be something that will, I don't want to say can interfere with them putting up their own boundaries, right? They're used to being maybe compliant. And so they may need stronger teaching around what it means to respect someone else's boundaries and what it means to respect their own boundaries. And then there's E, enjoyment, right? This is a good way for them. I mean, many of you may think back to when you were kids and, you know, you parents or older siblings or teachers or whoever may have said to you, you know, do you enjoy being with that person, right? Do you like playing with that person? I mean, it's that simple in some ways, right? We want to make sure that the relationships that they're participating are bring them some joy. It doesn't need to be a task at all times, right? It doesn't need to be something that they have to get through. So again, asking them if they enjoy being around certain people, and sometimes you'll see it in behaviors, right? You know, they may get very loud when they don't want to be with someone. They may see some aggressive behaviors. So it's being mindful of that and actually maybe triggering for yourself to start asking questions about that relationship. Okay.
And to be clear, not every relationship and people around you show healthy relationships.
Mhm.
And so when we're modeling language, or let's say you are, you know, going through a divorce, or you're divorced, or they know someone in relationships in their family that are not together, there's all sorts of different types of relationship. It's really important to use the language like, you know, dishonest instead of honest. They do not accept. They are disrespectful. Using the opposite language to explain why things don't work, but not to, I guess, vilify a relationship that isn't working, but pointing out how it's not healthy, but doing it in a very respectful way, and being able to also show examples of why relationships don't work, because we can't always provide the healthy option, the share. It may not exist, and it often doesn't in the world when we watch TV or do certain things. So you can say, why aren't you in a relationship with so-and-so anymore? It's because they didn't respect me. They didn't respect my boundaries. Use that language as well. And we'll get more into that as an unhealthy, but I just want to acknowledge and address that we're speaking about healthy relationships today, but we know that unhealthy stuff does come up as well. And we're going to address that next week, but just to make sure we balance the conversation now if any of those questions come up.
Yeah, because we have to remember that relationships are fluid, right? That, a relationship is not always great, and a relationship should not always be bad, right? That there will be ebbs and flows. And that can be the most challenging, especially for people that have been socially excluded, right? For most of their lives. If they're not playing with other kids in the schoolyard, if they're not attending camp with other people and, being encouraged to develop those kind of friendships or maybe other kind of relationships, it's harder to really understand that, there may be a desperation to cling on to an unhealthy relationship. So again, I mean, if there's, two things, I agree completely with what Deanna's saying, right? Use the opposite language to help them understand. But then, use the opportunity to show how do you get either out of those relationships or how do you support conflict resolution, developing skills.
Yeah. And those take work and those take conversations.
They take work for everybody,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's an ongoing, there's not a one-off. But again, it's focusing that, your children are not passive, right?
Absolutely.
They need to be encouraged to participate in their decision-making so that they end up in healthy relationships.
Absolutely. And healthy relationships leads us all into boundaries. That one of the most important things that everyone in society can benefit from, and is also very challenging. We're going to show you a quick video to and this is what we love to do, and this is something that we encourage, is you have visuals, conversations, and videos also help, right? That you kind of hit on all the ways people learn and think about and have conversations. So here's a good visual around sort of what boundaries are and that circle around, and then I'm just going to play a quick video for you about setting boundaries and back to the whole conversation around mental health lessons.
Imagine you created a beautiful garden, but you notice people walking through the grass, littering, or even picking the flowers you've grown. So you put up a fence to mark what is your space, and you now decide who can come in through the gate. This is how we would protect our garden, and is also how we should protect ourselves, by setting boundaries. Boundaries are limits we set for ourselves within relationships, be they romantic, professional, friends, or family. You want to clearly see where you end and someone else begins.
I describe boundaries like a roadmap of me showing you how best to have a relationship with me. It is me clearly expressing and communicating my values and preferences because I want you in my life.
Some examples of boundaries are physical boundaries, what you are comfortable with in terms of your own space and your own body. Emotional boundaries, what you are comfortable with sharing and what you would like to keep private. And time boundaries, how you would like to prioritize your own time and where you would like to take time to rest.
An example of a request would be, please stop raising your voice. An example of a boundary would be, if you continue to raise your voice, I'm leaving. That would be me clearly expressing my thoughts and feelings, being aware of what I'm responsible for, and being aware that I don't need to explain my no.
Boundaries are something that everyone can benefit implementing in their life because they not only protect our time and energy, they also protect our relationships. They prevent miscommunication, misunderstandings, and build up resentment. But what about when someone doesn't respect a boundary?
What's often difficult for people is what to do when somebody violates or oversteps a boundary. And if we use the earlier example that if somebody was to raise their voice at me, I am responsible for protecting myself. A lot of people fall into rescuing or fixing the other person, whereas that is up to me to protect myself. And if you continue to raise your voice at me, I leave.
If you feel like you need support, please contact your local mental health services.
So let's look at some of the things that were brought up in the video when we talk about boundaries. And some of these are easier to teach than others. We're not going to lie, right?
Yes.
And they all take practice. They all take a lot of practice. But, just seeing, again, this visual, right, that outlines, 8 different types of boundaries may help you with your conversations with your children, right? Physical boundaries seems to be one of the easier ones to teach, right? People may put up their arm's length, that kind of stuff. How close do you talk to someone when you're in public? But all of these teaching of all of these types of boundaries is really important for especially when people leave school, right? I'm not saying they're not important in school, but when they're starting to interact, because we always think of, the safety of our children living with us, or, children in a school system that we know quite well. But we need to start thinking about what happens when they go to work, right? What happens when they start to volunteer? What happens when they want to go to maybe a co-op placement? I mean, in certain circumstances and with certain people are going to understand maybe the challenges that your son or daughter may be facing, but people in the broader community may not, right? And all of these things, if boundaries aren't if boundaries aren't enforced, may lead to certain challenges, right? And again, which does that vicious cycle. And again, challenges lead to social exclusion. How many of us sit there and go, okay, I'm not going to try that anymore. It becomes really difficult. We're not going to go to that place anymore. We're not going to the movie theater. We're not going that. And then we see social exclusion getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And that's why Deanna and I are here to talk about this, and why we teach it is we want people with disabilities to be included as much as possible, as much as they want to be, right? There's safety in numbers. Mentally, it's, for mental health purposes, physical health, all those kind of things benefit when we're not socially excluded. Physical boundaries, I mean, we teach this. I mean, Deanna and I have done a couple of interesting things. You can put a hula hoop on the floor and have people stand around. But what I always like to do when I'm doing that is to maybe start to push that boundary a little bit and have people explore how they're physically feeling, right? Again, never underestimate the physical sensations. Kids know that, kids when they're really young or express the physical sensations may be a lot easier than we are with adults. We may be told, oh, don't cry, don't do these things. And then people start to internalize it. The uncomfortableness of certain situations. And we need to start giving that some language, or if not language, then we need to give them some way of communicating, I'm not feeling great, right? You're overstepping my boundary. So to me, that's one of the easiest, but one of the most important to teach. Time boundaries. I mean, we see this a lot when we're teaching kids in high school, right? When we're looking at it from an example, maybe of a healthy or unhealthy relationship, is the person always saying, you need to spend your time with me. You need to respond to my text right away. You need to walk with me to the lunchroom, whatever it is. But it's a way, it's one of those types of boundaries that can be easier to have people learn from. So looking at that. Verbal boundaries, again, how do we protect how we speak and what we discuss, right? Having privacy. privacy is a big word that we use a lot, right? It's okay, like Deanna was giving that example. You can say hi to your neighbors. Of course, that's friendly, that's welcoming, means you're part of the community, but not everybody needs to know your name, right? Again, protecting yourself by your verbal boundaries. Deanna, do you want to do any of these? Is there one that you really want to highlight?
Yeah, I think one of the things, a few of these, just as suggestions and conversation pieces, is like work boundaries. Work boundaries for me is sort of similar to school, and we try to mimic school as a working environment, right? Professional. We're there to learn. We're there to interact with peers, and protect your limits within the workplace, right? So your conversation, how you talk, how you touch, how you interact is really important, because what happens in school is what goes out into the adult world, the behaviors and the boundaries that you learn. So it's really important to make sure that you know that those things are happening in your classroom, right? So for instance, one of the things that Tracy and I are always really mindful of is, how does a teacher greet or touch the students? How do they show their care for the students? We have conversations about why side hugs are important, or hello or a high five are important. Because when they become adults, over the age of 18, the expectations and behavior has to be a very specific way, because they're adults. And so adults get held accountable by law, by adult behavior, but also sets them up for being professional as well. And that's really, really important. When you're young, it's different. But when you observe or you do certain things, like let's say shaking hands, right? It's formal, you shake hands. How do you do that? Why do you do that? If you're out for dinner and you meet someone or you see a colleague and you're shaking your hand in front of your son or daughter or the person you're caregiving for, you can explain, hey, that's so-and-so, we work together, we shake hands. It's something to say all of that out loud is really impactful. It really does make a difference. And the same with finances. I would have to say as kids, it's different, but as adults, finances is something that's helpful. And I think situations like when you go out for dinner, you talk about money, you talk about bill, that you actually have an interactive, open conversation. As you get older, you talk more and more about that. Whether they have financial literacy or not, it doesn't matter. Having the conversation and understanding is helpful, because you're having an open dialogue, and it creates some boundaries. At the very least, what's helpful, and Tracy and I have talked a lot about this, if we're doing a class session and people are to go out in the community to get something to eat, at the very least we say, okay, take your money, ask for a receipt, and bring back the change, right? You come home, you take a look at it. Not only are you giving them opportunities to, work on their self-esteem and their ability to try something, but you're also giving them some financial opportunities and some financial boundaries to take some action in that area. Sexual boundaries or healthy relationship boundaries are really, really important. This is one of the areas that we absolutely know that a lot of the individuals with developmental disabilities are not part of this conversation. And I know I spoke last week, and I'm going to speak to this week. Education around sexual health is abuse prevention. Okay, we're teaching people how to advocate for themselves and what to touch and who to touch and why. So boundaries are important. We talk about the physical boundaries in the space, but we have to talk about body parts and who touches them and why. That's part of sexual boundaries. That's part of understanding that if someone kisses you on the cheek or versus the lips or the forehead, conversations have to happen that way. And we want everyone to protect themselves in a physical sense in terms of space, but we also want to protect them from their body parts and what that sexual desire is, because that's what we all desire. Movies and television inform all those conversations. Again, if you see it on TV, they're watching it on TV and they look at romance, you ask them, what is romance? What is kissing? What is hand holding? Explain and discuss that openly. It may be a little embarrassing They may not want to talk about it, but if it's in and around you all the time, which it is in society, it's important to have a conversation. And I guess the other thing too, and we've talked a little bit about emotional boundaries, is your thoughts and feelings. It's a lot of times we know that through having discussions through our relationships and you workshop is individuals may not even be asked, how do you feel about this? What do you think about this? What do you think this is? Right? An opportunity for them to share their feelings, whether it's right or wrong. And that's why we often have to, when individuals are quite young, put language to the feelings. Right? So a yes or no feeling, a simple exercise is, a yes feeling is, what's your favorite food? A no feeling is, what's your least favorite food? That's a very simplified conversation, right? And then we move our way along a little bit more, depending on the abilities of the individual to talk about boundaries. We articulate and we put language to it. Okay, so is this a yes feeling or a no feeling? The same with, the physical, like Tracy said, you have a hula hoop, but when you remove it and someone stands right up, is that a yes feeling or a no feeling? So there's lots of ways to use different strategies and conversations to allow the emotional, and we talk about the gut feelings or those other pieces to come into play and to test and exercise. So boundaries is incredibly important. And we don't use those language. We don't use that language with the individuals, but we practice it and we talk about it. It's very, very empowering for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we mentioned last time a lot, think of the strategies when you're completing your, I'm thinking more of the IEP forms, the forms you get at the beginning of the year when you're thinking of, strengths and needs and goal setting and those kind of things. And, there is that part, beyond academics where they ask, what kind of skills do you want your child to learn during the year? Think about it if it helps to focus on thinking about these kind of boundaries that are skills that your child is going to have for the rest of their life, right? So think about when you're completing the IEP forms, is there a goal within the curriculum? And a lot of these things are in the curriculum that you want to highlight for your child's teaching in that school year in a nice, safe environment, right? Where they can get lots of practice. And they can learn from others, not just you, because parents and caregivers are busy, right? We're not trying to say this all has to happen at home. A lot of it starts at home, but think about how you can spread the learning experiences and encourage the learning experiences through the IEP or sharing this with even maybe some therapists, right? If your child's doing ABA therapy or other kinds of things, and these are some skills that sometimes get forgotten, that are going to be very impactful as your child grows up.
Yeah, absolutely. And those strategies of boundaries is really impactful if they're in the IEP and maybe they're one or two things that you work on at a time. And especially if you hear certain types of feedback on a regular basis that keeps happening and happening. So that might be the case too. Sorry about that. The other thing is what do boundaries sound like? Tracy, you want to start that off?
Sure. And this is where we start to talk about communication. And when we're teaching people about healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships, we talk about 3 different types of communication. And the first one is a very passive communication style. And it would sound something like, so for instance, I think that woman in the video gave a really good example. So if people are fighting, we'll go to the first picture on the top left. I will end this phone call if you continue to shout at me. If you think of it from a passive way, it could be someone almost like a whine. So picture that in your head or listening to that sound, I don't like the way you're talking to me. You need to stop talking to me that way. And if someone starts talking like that, you can see that they're in a very passive frame of mind, right? They believe that the relationship is happening to them, the bad interaction is happening to them. And they're showing you that they don't have the skills to understand that they are responsible for the way they behave, right? So passive communication can be very challenging to overcome. It can be, because for a lot of people, it's gotten them what they wanted at that time, right? People, but you can't count on the other person in the relationship, or you can't always count on a staff member or a teacher to be there to interfere or to, you know, help with conflict resolution. So when we're talking about what boundaries sound like, we don't want to be passive in the way we're responding, but we also don't want to be aggressive, right? You know, aggressive conversation can be, you know, shouting, it can be, you know, threatening, all those kind of things. What we're aiming for here is what we call an assertive conversation, right? And I like that example. I will end this phone call if you continue to shout at me. If you know, obviously, depending on how your child communicates, you know, this is just one example, but you can see that the person is being assertive. They're confident in what they know about what's unhealthy or not unhealthy relationships. They're confident in their ability to end, right, an interaction that may not be benefiting them, or they may find threatening or unsafe. And it's about giving that kind of language where people can be assertive or confident, maybe is another way of saying it, without getting into the trap of, you know, maybe acting out. It is a skill. It takes a lot of practice. I think we're all guilty of doing the either or, right? The passive kind of communication, or, you know, being a little too aggressive. It takes there's a comfortableness in being assertive and confident. But what do boundaries sound like? I can stay for half an hour. That tells me that that person knows what the time they're willing to give up, right? I'm willing to give you, and it's respectful, I'm willing to give you a half an hour of my time, because it's kind of setting the stage for the other person to know, you know what, I do have other commitments. I do have other things I need to do, but I care enough about you that I can stay for half an hour. So you can see the respect in that kind of assertive language. You know, how to turn something down graciously. A lot of people that we've supported, they're very desperate to have friends. They're very desperate to be included, which can lead to, unfortunately, circumstances of bullying and being taken advantage of. But you can see this woman saying, you know, thank you for your offer. Unfortunately, I can't make it. Again, understanding that it's okay to say no to something, right? That, you know, I know you really may want to do it, but just because you're saying no to something doesn't mean, if you don't do it in a respectful way, that doesn't mean you're going to hurt somebody's feelings. Sometimes the people that we've taught classes to around relationships, they're so afraid of offending someone else, right? And it's about flipping that language and giving them the tools to say no. Saying no to something doesn't mean you're trying to be disrespectful, doesn't mean you're not being a caring person. What it means, though, is that you're being confident and that you're knowing your limits, you're knowing your boundaries, and it's okay to voice those boundaries, right? I need time to think about it. I'll come back to you. That's one of my favorites. When I'm teaching consent, making sure that people understand that they have the option of not making a decision right away, right? How many of us actually make our decisions right away? We can say that, you know what, oh, I don't know if I'm going to come to that party. I'll get back to you. I don't know if I'm going to sign that contract, you know, with the heating person that's coming in to fix your plumbing or whatever, right? We all do this, but sometimes the people that, again, that Deanna and I support are so worried about offending someone, right? They want us to be able to say yes or no, and they feel that if they can't say yes or no right away, then maybe they're lacking confidence. And again, it's about encouraging them to say, you know what, if you don't feel that you can come to the decision that's best for you, then it's okay to say, I'll come back to you, right? I'll get back to you on that one. Which one stands out for you, Deanna?
I think one of the things is, I guess less about opinion, but we see a lot, and I'm sure Tracy will agree, like people ask someone, oh, do you want to come out with me to the movies? And they just say, no, I don't want to go. And then they become obsessed with, why don't you want to go? Why don't you want to go? Why can't you go? Why can't you come with me? Don't you like the movie? And sort of that we're not always comfortable with just with a simple no, I don't want to go, right? Because it creates an insecurity, it creates a worry like they don't like me, they don't want to be my friend, I want a friend, and then it just kind of cycles through. And I think it's really important we have discussions is, you know, if someone doesn't want to go, then that's fine. Maybe you just say, okay, you know, maybe we can go another time. Is creating the healthy conversation like that rather than being really abrupt. And sometimes it's not always easy. And also just to be incredibly respectful. Being respectful is a very hard thing for you know, the individuals that we talk to, because they've been bullied. They're not respected. We hear things like, well, we know that we've been a burden to our families and to our siblings. We know that, you know, they spend a lot of time taking us to the doctors or having appointments, and that we just go to the doctor, we do certain things, and they feel guilty. And there's a level of guilt they can articulate. And then when they talk, they're not respected, because why would they know any different? Because, you know, they have a disability. Does their opinion matter? And are they included in the conversation? And so a lot of times when we're facilitating these workshops, we ask, what do you think about, you know, this? What do you think about this? And it's incredible how empowering it is. What this comes down to self-esteem. This comes down to that as well. And then boundaries with the conversation. But if you don't feel respected about your opinion, and then question where your opinion comes from, it's really, really hard to feel that confidence and set those boundaries. And so sometimes we start there first, right? Really talking about that. And in the workshops that we do, we're constantly modeling these things in conversation all the time, you know, and we know that all eyes are on us. So it can be very intense, especially in the beginning. You know, Tracy and I have done these 8-week programs where, you know, individuals who start with us leave in a very different way. And there's victories, maybe small or large, but there are victories. And things like, you know, we will have an individual that's in our personal space all the time, right? And so it'd be like, you know, I put my hand out and it's like, okay, can you just step back a little bit further? I need my personal space. What did you want to ask me, right? So those are constantly intentionally set, to the point where when they come up to you, they don't do it, or they come to you and then they step back, right? That little bit of work for 8 weeks can make a huge difference in how they communicate and how they relate to people. And that can make a huge difference in their relationships in their life. The other big thing about boundaries is making sure that being thankful, right? That's a hard thing for people to feel when they have never had an opportunity, right? To be asked, or there's offer, maybe it never comes through. So, you know, oftentimes what we do is we look at what their passions are, for instance. So if their passion is about hockey or music, we ask them, what would you like to play today? And we learn maybe about a song, or learn about some sports, and we work with their things that they love, and we thank them for teaching us something new, right? But then if it's too much and they keep going on about it, we'll just say, well, we already spoke about that. Thank you for sharing. We're going to move on now, right? And so creating boundaries around maybe some what people would describe as more obsessive behaviors is letting them have time in a platform and then moving on from there. So that's part of boundaries too. So you're constantly modeling that in a classroom setting. There's so many examples of it. But if you do those little things now and you do those in your IEPs and address those early on, it has a very long lasting effects. So we've talked a lot about what they are, but how do we support a healthy relationship? What I've been doing since I think I've started the workshop and kind of addressing the conversations and through a lot of the research and reading and workshops and and discussions that Tracy and myself and other colleagues and I myself has is just the word etiquette or good manners. Just socially, how our social emotional intelligence, how do we navigate the world day to day? And there's a lot of examples, not great ones out there. And also as parents and caregivers, we are the teachers of these things, but so is society, so is everyone else. And one of the things that we very quickly discover is, how the expectations and how individuals with developmental disabilities, not all, but the pressure, there's no pressure here, but how they navigate the world in terms of their etiquette and their manners may or may not be important. And I'm here to tell you they are, because it's all attached to self-esteem. And things like in our workshop, we will do things like we'll go out in the community and we'll go get a drink somewhere, maybe at a local Tim Hortons or something. There's so many different things that we're doing in that moment. So one of the exercises is let's hold the door open for someone if we see that they're struggling or they're coming in and out of the door. We do little things, social etiquette things like that. And then we go back to the classroom, or we go back to wherever we're at, and we talk about how does that feel? Someone said thank you. Did they say this? Were they surprised? Attach a feeling to that action. And what you're going to start to see is their recognition and wanting to do that, to be helpful. But again, with boundaries, right? But social etiquette is so incredibly helpful, not just for everyone's society, but it shifts the teacher and the student scenario, right? So one of the other things that we get a lot of conversations about is telephone etiquette. And for all of us who are parents, for all of us that are in environments constantly, what I see hands down is a lot of the individuals we're supporting, even socially our own kids, are not getting the social etiquette they deserve and need. And when it comes to the telephone, largely we're ignoring folks. And we're doing it in such a way where we're sitting with them, but we're not talking with them. So the kind of feedback I hear is we go out for lunch or dinner and everyone's on the phone. Or I went out in the community with my worker and they were on the phone, right? And that's difficult, very challenging over time to feel good about yourself or to feel like you're part of society when you are constantly facing the back of someone's phone or half listening. And so be intentional in having those conversations and allow them to be empowered to say, hey, can you put your phone down and pay attention, and vice versa. The other areas that are really important that we've learned is washroom etiquette, especially in a public washroom setting. It's really important that people understand that they're in a public washroom, and their behavior and their actions in a public setting could get them attention, maybe wanted or unwanted, and also how they're expected to behave. And go out in the community and use the public washrooms and see how that goes. And it's not always easy. I understand. But again, having the conversation about, when we went to the washroom, this happened. How did you feel? How do you think other people feel? I think attaching those experiences are really, really important, and having those conversations. And we do all of these things. Eating etiquette. A lot of times in workshops and discussions, when we talk about eating etiquette, is we look at different ways people eat, different cultures, all sorts of things like that. And then we talk about the, tipping, and we talk about eating and receipts and experiences and meals and what's your favorite food and sort of the connection and interaction food is. But then how do we integrate etiquette and how do we get people to eat? Because when you want a relationship or a healthy relationship, and let's say you want to go on a date or you want to be with someone and you want to go to a movie, is all these things are embedded in having a healthy, successful relationship and going out. So these are things that maybe we've learned with our peers, learned in movies, but actually never put them to action. And so these are all fun exercises to do with the individuals or your son or daughter or people in the community. Is we got to use these opportunities to interact Another good example is there's a lot of meetings. I'm sure that you've attended or will continue to attend. An IEP meeting is one of them. One of the things that we talk a lot about is anytime we're in a meeting, and this is with my own children, is I explain why we're in a meeting, where we're going, and what we're going to do, and what the expectations are. Do you have any questions or thoughts? Let's write them down beforehand. I don't ever want, and I really hope to never want, or for our kids to experience that they just show up and we're talking about them and not to them. And that's something that we want to shift, because that also affects self-esteem. And I know that none of us would if we do the same to ourselves. So preparing and having the dialogue. And sometimes we're busy, I understand. Maybe we're going to a medical appointment, we don't know why. And being able to explain it whether or not they ask is just saying, we're going to an appointment today at this time to this time. This is what we're going to be talking about. Do you have any questions or, thoughts, or, ease the expectations around what's going to happen. Maybe the travel time, maybe how to get there, all those good things. You know your loved one best, but be a part of the conversation and talk about it out loud. It has such huge benefits for laying the groundwork from child to moving into their adult life, and how they interact with their peers. And maybe, they live with other people, or live in a group home, or live independently. Whatever those things are in their life, that's what you're setting up for now. And has to be intentional. And I know we're all busy, we get tired, but even a couple of conversations are so helpful. And so I use this kind of infographic here. I use these exercises in conversation constantly. And I embed it in our day-to-day conversation as they come up. So depending on what's happening, what we talked about, this is the kind of thing that needs to be thought about. And depending on your job role or what you do, how you explain your work, all those things allow people to have insight, and we're educating people at the same time. Tracy, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about etiquette or manners, one of the, depending on who we're teaching the course to, and we talk about etiquette, a lot of people go, what's that mean, right? Like, it's a huge word. But when we talk about manners, I like to break these down and use them in unison with the circles, right? So looking at different etiquette, because there isn't just one etiquette. And I think that's where sometimes people get tricked into thinking, there's only one type of bathroom etiquette. Well, of course, there's certain things we all do in the bathroom, right? But there's different things that you'll do in a public bathroom that you may not do, that you'll do at home, like those kind of things. You will eat differently probably at home, and then maybe eat differently, when you're in public, or if you're at a fancy meal, those kind of things. So we always, when we're doing it, we always like to bring up the etiquette with the different relationships, right? So we talk about, at home, it may be okay to walk around, without socks and those kind of things, but at school, that's not an okay thing to do, right? So using, something like this, or just looking at the different manners, understanding that manners change depending on the relationship and depending on the location. Some people fall into the trap thinking that it's always this way and it's always going to be that way. And then we're setting the people that we're supporting up for failure, right? We have to understand that and have that kind of conversation. This is where the challenge can be, is knowing that sometimes things can be fluid, right? And again, using etiquette is again a great way to bring up how do you deal with conflict resolution. So some people learn etiquette really, really well and have an expectation that everybody's going to follow the same etiquette. That whole, well, why do they not have to do that and I have to do that? Again, like Deanna said, it comes back to your values, it comes back to your beliefs, it comes back to self-esteem. But again, it's always a tool of joining in parts of the conversation and being aware that, some people may experience things differently, or have different expectations. But again, you're not passive, that you can only take responsibility for yourself, right? And I think that's the message that Deanna and I always try to send out in the world that, you know, when we're teaching anything about any type of relationship, especially sexual relationships, you have to be responsible for yourself, right? You're in charge of your body, you're in charge of your mind. And that, you know, everything that we do or say has consequences. And, you know, people will react differently. So there's different ways of, you know, getting your point across. But always remembering that things can be more fluid, right? And that can be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, some of the examples of things that have come up, again, where we talk about etiquette, and you know, we tend to tell our kids, don't do that, put that away, stop doing that, but we don't explain why. And I think we have to take it a step further. So, you know, if you know, if a good example is if they're picking their nose, and we've seen this in the adults and children's world, and with my own kids too. You know, if they're picking their nose, to just say, I have no problem with you picking your nose, please use a tissue and perhaps go to the bathroom, right? Or use a tissue, because it's bad manners, right? Because it makes me feel uncomfortable, or it's yucky, right? So being able to explain that a little bit further allows them to understand that this isn't just something I'm telling you not to do, but this is actually something that's uncomfortable. And what's really interesting, over a couple of maybe one or two more reminders, you'll see them say, do you have a tissue, right? So you maybe have tissues always available. Or if you see them doing it, you just subtly say, I think you need a tissue and you need to go to the washroom, right? Those things have huge impact. The same with, you know, if someone's constantly touching you or tapping you, just say, you know, please don't touch me. You didn't ask, or just give me a minute, take a deep breath, give me a minute. Or, you know, all sorts of examples around just sort of rushing or doing certain things. I explain it. One of the big things in the bathroom, for instance, is if you go into a public washroom, we get a lot of feedback sometimes around people, what way they behave or not. And we'll say, okay, remember when you go in that any person's in there, right? Anyone could go in there. You're not by yourself. So what do you do if you're on the street? What do you do when you're out in the community, right? You go to the washroom, or what do you think you should do, right? We kind of walk it through it, especially if something's happened where maybe they're sitting there yelling and screaming and talking to themselves. You know, maybe we explain to them, well, why would you do that? What do you think would happen or make other people feel, right? If they have the ability to even have the dialogue, it can make a huge difference, and it allows people to understand what their behavior is rather than just telling them stop doing it. Give them an opportunity. It may never work, but you know what? It's a conversation, and maybe someday it will surprise you, or maybe it will work for someone else. But it's such a worthy conversation to have, because this is all attached to self-esteem, self-worth, and contribution, what the contribution they can make. I think we're at the end of our presentation. Tracy, do you have anything else to add?
All I would
Get
like to say is,
questions?
I think we're going to do questions in a minute. I'm trying to see. Yes. But you know, I'm hoping that everybody can come back next week, where Deanna and I will walk you through some of the actual exercises that we use, and show you the tools that might be useful at home, or might be useful to share with, you know, any therapists or anybody at school. So hopefully you'll come back next week too.
What we just wanted to let you guys know is that we have resources which will be attached and shared with you at the end of the presentations, little downloads and tips and things, because I know there's no way that you can possibly remember all the things we're talking about. And so you're able to access some of those later on. But I just wanted to let you know that we'll be ending the recording now, and then we'll get into questions after.